Is this really Buddhism or just fear wearing a robe? Let us begin with a precise question. Why was this talk created? Not to attack a person, not to criticize a sect, not to provoke controversy. It exists for one reason only: to distinguish authentic Buddhist philosophy from narratives that weaponize fear in its name. In recent years, we encounter striking claims. Meditation is fake. If a body remains after death, its karmic residue harms descendants. Without ritual purification, disaster will follow your bloodline. These statements sound powerful, urgent, almost prophetic, but we must ask carefully. Are these truly Buddhist teachings, or are they fear-based constructions borrowing Buddhist vocabulary? The distinction matters, because when fear replaces clarity, religion becomes control. Meditation, not magic, not fraud, but structural alignment of consciousness. In Tibetan Buddhism, meditation bhavana is not a supernatural technique. It is not a productivity hack. It is not a shortcut to success or emotional anesthesia, but neither is it optional, nor is it fraudulent. From early Buddhist texts through Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, the triadic training of ethics, sila, concentration, samadhi, and wisdom, prajna, remains structurally intact. Concentration is not decorative. It is axial. No canonical text claims that intellectual comprehension alone liberates a person. The consistent position is this: understanding is insufficient. Direct seeing is required. Meditation does not manufacture enlightenment. It conditions consciousness so that enlightenment becomes structurally possible. Why then do some modern voices declare that meditation is fake? Usually for two reasons. First, a results-based misunderstanding. I meditated, but my life didn't transform. I meditated, but suffering remains. Second, a reaction against the commodification of mindfulness. 10 minutes to guaranteed success. Download this app to erase anxiety. Watch this video to cure depression. Criticizing commercialization is legitimate. Rejecting meditation itself is philosophically incoherent. The accurate statement is not meditation is fake. It is. Selling meditation as a tool for ego gratification is deceptive. Tibetan Buddhism never equated meditation with wish fulfillment. It defines meditation as structural calibration of awareness. Karma is not stored in bones. Let us address a more serious doctrinal distortion: the claim that physical remains bones, ashes, genetic lineage transmit karmic consequences to descendants. This position does not align with Tibetan Buddhist doctrine. Karma is not material residue. It is not genetic inheritance. It is not transmitted through bloodline. Karma operates through continuity of consciousness, through patterns of volitional intention and repeated perception. No canonical source asserts that skeletal remains serve as karmic transmitters. When fear is framed this way: if you fail to purify, your children will suffer. The mechanism is clear. Anxiety is amplified. Guilt is induced. Behavior is controlled through intergenerational threat. That is a regulatory structure, not a liberative one. Buddhist philosophy consistently resists determinism. It preserves agency. Its central claim is radical. You can't awaken now. Not your ancestor, not your descendant. You. The moment karma is materialized, responsibility shifts from awareness to superstition. And that shift is doctrinally unsound. The radical compassion of liberation through hearing. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, more precisely translated as The Great Liberation Through Hearing in the Bardo, presents one of the most philosophically daring propositions in Buddhist literature. It declares, even when action is impossible, even when the body is gone, even when meditation cannot be performed, hearing alone may liberate. This does not mean passive listening. In Buddhist epistemology, hearing includes structured meaning, repetition, Imprint formation in consciousness. Activation during crisis states. Liberation through hearing means this. When consciousness encounters extreme destabilization, previously internalized interpretive frameworks may prevent collapse. The text is read to the dying because language, heard in life, can function as an anchor in transitional states. Buddhism does not assume humans awaken instantly. It recognizes habit, energy, vasana. Repeat anger, anger arises first. Repeat fear, fear interprets the world. Repeat. Clarity becomes available under pressure. If a person repeatedly hears, this is projection. This fear is a mental construction. This confusion is transitional, not ultimate. Then in a destabilizing moment, that cognitive imprint may activate. This is not mystical. It is structural. Bardo is not only after death. Western audiences often reduce Bardo to a mythological post-mortem realm. But in Tibetan philosophy, Bardo means intermediate state. More precisely, a condition in which identity has dissolved, but a new one has not yet formed. By that definition, Bardo is everywhere. Adolescence is Bardo. Career transition is Bardo. Midlife existential crisis is Bardo. Burnout is Bardo. Divorce is Bardo. Retirement is Bardo. In each case, the former identity no longer stabilizes perception. The new identity has not cohered. During such states, anxiety intensified. Images become exaggerated. Fear feels metaphysical. The Book of the Dead describes terrifying visions, radiant lights, seductive forms, judgmental presences. Taken literally, these are mythic. Understood phenomenologically, they are cognitive distortions, amplified by instability. When identity collapses, interpretive anchors disappear. Unprocessed fear becomes an external threat. Unresolved guilt appears as a judge. Unintegrated desire appears as salvation. Modern corporate burnout mirrors Bardo phenomenology. Performance anxiety. Comparison obsession, failure catastrophization. Yet at precisely these moments, disciplined meditation is often inaccessible. Exhaustion prevents formal practice. Here, the doctrine of liberation through hearing becomes existentially relevant. If action is unavailable, interpretation remains possible. If one can recognize, I am in transition. This is structural destabilization. This fear is a projection, then collapse may be arrested. Liberation in this text is not mystical annihilation. It is the cessation of misrecognition. Liberation as direction, not spectacle. Many modern people imagine liberation as permanent bliss, absence of difficulty, transcendent experience. But in the Tibetan text, liberation is often defined more modestly, recognizing illusion as illusion. The moment projection is recognized as projection, consciousness ceases compounding its own descent. Even in ordinary professional life, if a person can say, this anxiety is not an ultimate truth, this transitional confusion is not failure, then ignorance, avidya, is no longer accelerated. That redirection is already liberation in motion. Fear as control versus insight as freedom. Consider the structure of statements such as, if you do not live correctly, your children will suffer. Philosophically, this is a control mechanism. Trigger insecurity. Invoke future generations. Govern present behavior through fear. Authentic Buddhist doctrine does not rely on inherited damnation. It emphasizes present awareness. The difference is subtle but decisive. Fear-based religion says, comply or catastrophe spreads. Awakening-centered philosophy said, recognize, and misperception dissolves. One governs behavior. The other transforms cognition. A final request. If this dialogue accomplishes anything, let it be this: that Buddhism is understood not as mystical threat, but as disciplined phenomenology of consciousness. Not as bloodline fatalism, but as radical responsibility, not as fear management, but as interpretive clarity. If these reflections are meaningful, continue the inquiry. Share the conversation. Extend the dialogue, because wisdom is not diminished by distribution. It is refined by it. An awakening in its most rigorous sense begins not with terror, but with accurate seeing. Fear is not the foundation. Then what is karma? In the previous discussion, we clarified something essential. Authentic Buddhist teaching does not operate through fear. It does not threaten bloodlines. It does not manipulate guilt. It does not anchor causality in bones or ashes. So then we must ask carefully and philosophically. If karma is not punishment, not a curse, not a metaphysical virus carried in DNA, what is it? In classical Buddhist analysis, particularly in the Abhidhamma and the Yogacara tradition, karma is defined with striking precision. Karma is intentional action leaving a trace in consciousness. More exact, the accumulated directional tendency formed by repeated volitional choices. This means karma is not a thing. It is a path. It is the architecture built by repeated thoughts, repeated interpretations, repeated reactions, repeated emotional habits. If I repeatedly interpret ambiguity as threat, fear becomes my default lens. If I repeatedly interpret difficulty as humiliation, resentment becomes automatic. If I repeatedly observe my own reactions without collapsing into them, clarity becomes available under pressure. This is karma, not a supernatural sentence, but a structural momentum of awareness. There is no role here for bones, no metaphysical residue stored in tissue, no ancestral transmission of moral debt. To be fair, confusion sometimes arises because psychology acknowledges something similar. Parents influence children. Environment shapes emotional development. Trauma can echo across generations. But these are sociological and psychological mechanisms, not Buddhist karma. Buddhist karma does not flow through bloodlines. It is not genetically inherited. It cannot be forced upon another consciousness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead pushes this principle to its logical extreme. Everything you see is the projection of your own mind. This statement eliminates cosmic blame. No one carries your karma for you. No one can transfer awakening to you. No ancestor condemns you. No descendant redeems you. Responsibility in Buddhism is not guilt. It is causality, not you deserve punishment. But this pattern generates this state of mind. Responsibility is not judicial. It is phenomenological. Even the terrifying judgment scenes described in the Bardo are not divine verdicts. They are self-recognition intensified. When this is misunderstood, Buddhism collapses into fear religion, and fear in Buddhist psychology is not a tool of awakening. It produces projection, externalization, defensiveness, submission, all of which move consciousness away from direct seeing. The most dangerous moment in the Bardo, according to Tibetan doctrine, is not encountering frightening visions. It is believing them to be objectively real. Why fear-based interpretations keep returning. If Buddhist doctrine is so clear, why do fear-based narratives reappear? The answer is sociological, not mystical. Fear simplifies complexity. It accelerates obedience. It bypasses introspection. When teachings are difficult, when disciplined meditation requires effort, when doctrinal nuance becomes hard to communicate, fear becomes a shortcut. If you don't purify, your children will suffer. If you fail to practice, catastrophe spreads. These are administratively efficient messages, but they are philosophically incompatible with the Buddha's invitation. Do not believe, see. Once karma is materialized, once responsibility is transferred to lineage, once enlightenment becomes compliance, Buddhism is no longer a phenomenology of consciousness. It becomes moral governance. Is a life without formal practice a failed life? This question weighs heavily on modern professionals. Traditional Buddhist models emphasize monastic life, extended meditation retreats, strict ethical discipline, structured communal practice. Most contemporary people cannot replicate those conditions. So a subtle despair arises. I am structurally disqualified. Enlightenment is not for someone like me. But this conclusion rests on partial absolutization. If we look carefully at early Buddhist narratives, awakening was not limited to monks, merchants, farmers, administrators, parents. What distinguished them was not perfect circumstances. It was the willingness to look directly at experience. Buddhism assumes human imperfection from the start. There is craving. There is fear. There is confusion. The decisive variable is not purity, but orientation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead articulates this beautifully. One who recognizes fear as fear is not fully consumed by it. Awakening begins not with transcendence, but with noticing. Why ordinary professional life can become practice. Modern working life is repetitive, competitive, and exhausting. From a Buddhist perspective, this is not disqualifying. It is diagnostically rich. Comparison, insecure ambition, resentment, performance anxiety. These arise daily, vividly, without concealment. This makes contemporary life an unusually transparent field of practice. Repeated listening to philosophical teaching, even through digital media, does not promise immediate transformation, but it creates minimal structural shifts. You stop equating emotion with identity. You stop treating thoughts as unquestionable facts. You stop interpreting pain as proof of personal failure. These may appear small. In Buddhist analysis, they are tectonic. Liberation is often misunderstood as arrival, a final, perfected state. But in classical terms, liberation is directional. When awareness tilts toward grasping, cyclical suffering intensifies. When awareness tilts toward recognition, misidentification weakens. Even brief repeated engagement with accurate teaching introduces micro adjustments in that tilt. That is not trivial. That is trajectory. Meditation, listening, and understanding. Not competitors, but layers. Let us clarify 3 modalities. Meditation, direct cultivation of attentional stability and insight. Listening, formation of interpretive frameworks that stabilize consciousness in crisis. Understanding, the conceptual lens that converts raw experience into insight rather than panic. These are not rival paths. They operate at different depths and under different conditions. The error arises when one is absolutized and the others dismissed. When that happens, living Buddhism becomes rigid ideology. Why the text chooses awareness over fear. Fear compels action. Awareness alters direction. The Tibetan Book of the Dead could have emphasized terror in the face of death. Instead, it repeats a single instruction. Do not be afraid. This is your own mind. Fear strengthens compulsive reaction. Recognition interrupts dissent, using ancestral remains to frighten descendants, invoking guilt to regulate obedience, constructing narratives of inherited doom. These are languages of management, not liberation. They regulate behavior. They do not transform perception. A closing reflection for the modern professional. If you feel unable to perform ideal practice, if you believe your life is too fragmented, too busy, too flawed, consider this carefully. Your life is not disqualified. It is a laboratory of consciousness. If in anxiety, you question. If in confusion, you seek clarity. If in exhaustion, you remain willing to understand, then you are already oriented toward awakening. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is not a manual for the deceased. It is a guide for the living, so that when identity destabilizes, consciousness does not collapse into projection. Its final teaching remains radically simple. Do not be afraid. This is your own mind, if that sentence can be remembered. Repeated. recalled in moments of destabilization, then the axis of awareness has already shifted. Not toward superstition, not toward compliance, but toward seeing. And in Buddhism, accurate seeing is the beginning of freedom.